Hi, everyone. Thanks. I'm Elizabeth Agee, and I'm from the University of Michigan, and I'm in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. And I'm going to be talking today about the contributions of tree root systems to forest drought resilience, so maybe something a little bit different from what we've been talking about before. But I just wanted to acknowledge my co-authors on this. This is the result of a lot of different people coming together from a lot of different disciplines. So our work is primarily in the Amazon rainforest. So this requires data from ecologists, biologists. We even have electrical engineers and civil engineers like myself working on this type of project. So we have funding that comes from the Department of Energy Go Amazon project. And through that, the PIs, Rafael Oliveira and Scott Seleska, their labs have contributed a lot of data. So I'm a hydrologist, so I care a lot about the role of vegetation in the water cycle. So there have been studies done to try to partition out different water fluxes. And what we find is that if you look at terrestrial water, over 60% of the water on the land surface is going to return to the atmosphere through these plant vascular pathways. Now, you would think with that being such a significant portion of our water cycle, the hydrological models would include a lot of vegetation. Well, it kind of turns out that vegetation isn't represented so well in hydrological models. So what I'm trying to do through my PhD work is try to increase that representation so we can, when we're looking at systems like these forests, we're accurately characterizing how they're going to behave under water limitation. So my work right now is I've been implementing in a three-dimensional model of root water uptake, and this involves several parts. So for a model like this, we're actually including every single tree in the domain. So for each tree, we're creating an architecture, a root system for that, and we're coupling that with a flow model. So the flow model that I use is a model called P-Flowtran. It's a highly parallel model that solves a three-dimensional Richards equation. It has been used in other types of studies that actually model the transport of uranium from nuclear waste sites, carbon sequestration, and a lot of different applications. So what we've been doing is actually including the root water uptake as a sync term to the Richards equation. Now there's a lot that goes into this process, and I'm kind of glossing over a lot of details, but I would love to talk to anybody about it, because who doesn't like to talk about the research? But essentially, why we need blue waters is because when we're adding this level of complexity, we need to understand that plant scale models, even if you're taking a model of a root system of, say, a corn plant, the computational complexity of that is on the 10 to the 6 number of computational nodes. So that's one corn plant. And we want to model forests. So if, in order to understand these community dynamics and get hundreds and thousands of individuals uptaking water simultaneously, we need a lot of computational power. Also, another aspect of it is plant water uptake is highly dependent on the local soil water gradients. So we need to be able to understand and resolve the soil moisture in very fine resolutions. So we have a lot of computational nodes included in that aspect as well. Also, because we are trying to model plants, these plants, there's a lot of different species, and a lot of different species that actually behave differently within themselves. So our data space on this is actually quite scarce, and in order to accurately characterize the system, we need to do some more ensemble modeling methods in order to quantify the uncertainty and see what realizations may actually happen in nature. So to give you an idea of what type of parameters I'm talking about, we can see an example here where we're looking at lateral spread. So lateral spread is really just the radius of the root system out from the base of the tree. So on this map here, we have each of these black dots represents a tree, and the size of the dot is actually the size of the tree trunk. And we can relate the size of the tree trunk to the actual radius of the root system, so those circles around. So in this example, you can see that some are overlapping with each other, and some have their own soil water space that they're operating from. But the truth is, we don't actually know how far root systems really extend from trees. It could depend on a lot of variables. So we wanted to test if we have the same amount of roots in a system, how would different lateral spreads impact where they actually get their water and their ability to maintain their transpiration stream. So we tested several scenarios. You see that this is a situation where the lateral spread just got a little bit wider, and again, we're going even further out. So in this case, we have everybody overlapping with each other, so everyone's competing for the same soil water reserves, but we've kept the total amount of root biomass the same in the system. So when we do that, we can actually start to see these dynamics of what happens of where trees are going to get their water. So this plot right here is showing the shift away from the center of mass of the root system. So if you're well watered, you expect that the tree's going to pull water from its entire biomass profile. So therefore, the centroid of uptake would be at the center of mass. So that would be our 0 line. So in this simulation, these bars represent precipitation. So this was simulated over a whole growing season. So in this growing season, early on we have a lot of precipitation, and in this red area is a dry period of the simulation. So there's very little rain. And then again, we get wet. So you can see, while we're in this wet part of the simulation, it is pretty much uptaking near its center of mass. But when we get into this dry, you see that the roots are able to dynamically shift. As we increase that lateral spread and have more lateral interactions and more level of competition, you see that more and more of these trees are forced to get their water from deeper, moister layers of the soil. Now, if we want to just expand this out here, this is a representation of that root biomass profile that I keep referring to. This blue area would be its center of mass, and you see how that lines up with the centroid of uptake. So you start off here in the wet period, and you'll dip down into these deeper layers as it's drying out the shallow layers of the soil. And these, the uptake from these deeper layers will compensate for that and allow us to maintain our transpiration stream. But one thing you might also notice is that there's a lot of spikes in this, right? Those spikes are actually representing these tiny precipitation events. So a small influx of water comes into our system, and the trees are able to actively respond and pop their uptake back up across their entire profile. Now, this isn't any input actually from the tree, so the tree's not expending energy to do this. This is all based on physical water potential gradients in the system. So this is all physics-based. There we go. So why does this matter for regions like the Amazon? Well, water limitation is actually a big deal. Climate models are projecting that the entire basin region is going to become drier over the next 50 years to 100 years. Couple that, we also have these strong correlations with El Nino events. So it's been shown that strong El Nino events will cause severe dry seasons, more dry seasons in the Amazon region. So we saw this in 2005 and in 2010 with severe droughts, but we also saw it most recently in 2015. So to kind of give you an example of how our traditional hydrological models aren't capturing these dynamics well in the Amazon, here's some work that was actually done by my advisor in 2012. And what we're showing here is he did a model where we just used the traditional root biomass profile in modeling water uptake. And you see in this blue line is the simulated, and the green line is the actual observations of water fluxes in the system. And you see that during this dry season where water is limited, our simulated fluxes aren't quite matching what's actually observed. The plants are able to keep going and keep uptaking water longer than we would expect in our hydro models. But what he did, he was actually adding in a little bit more complexity by adding in different biomass profiles depending on where you were in the canopy. So smaller trees in the canopy would occupy a biomass that was more shallower. Mid-level trees would have mid-range biomass profiles, and canopy trees would go deeper. And by adding in just that little bit more of a representation of roots, he was actually able to improve simulations and match more closely what was observed. Now that is great, but that's just a simplification of the system, and it's not actually telling you how different tree species are going to respond. So in order to do that, we have to do a lot of integration of our different data streams and with our models. So I know everyone here is more computationally based, and I love computation too, but I'm also a field scientist, and so I would challenge you to also remember the importance of our data streams and where we get our data for the validation and parameterizations of our models. It's just as important to push those forward at the same time as we're pushing towards exascale. So what we do in our field work is that we actually have a field site in the eastern Amazon. It's called Kilometer 67. It's on the Tapajós River in eastern Brazil. And from that site, we are gathering data on the roots. We're gathering water flows from the trees using sat flow sensors. We go up to the canopy and install sensors that measure water stress in the trees. We measure leaf function. And we also have eddy covariance towers, which are measuring water and carbon fluxes from the forest at a larger landscape footprint, and also meteorological variables at the site. So we're using that and trying to integrate it into a more holistic picture of what's going on in the forest. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of a plant economic spectrum. So we try to characterize plant behavior by thinking of it as like an investment strategy. So if you're investing in risky stocks, you may have a big payoff, or you could go bust. So there is the spectrum here with plants. Some engage in what we call risky behavior, and some engage in what's more conservative in their water usage. An example of risky behavior would be they want to keep uptaking water as long as they can, even when the soil moisture is drying up, because when you uptake water, you can also assimilate carbon and photosynthesize and grow and make sugars and outcompete your neighbors. But the problem with that is if you keep trying to uptake water as the soil is getting too dry, you run the risk of embolizing your vessels and potentially dying from too much hydraulic damage. On the other side of that coin, there's a more conservative strategy, where as soon as you start feeling just a little bit water stressed, you can close up your stomata, stop uptaking water, but you also stop assimilating carbon, and you stop gaining that benefit as well. Now, that's all well and good, but if the drought goes on too long and you don't get enough sugars, you can die from carbon starvation. So in biodiverse environments like the Amazon, you have trees that can run the gamut of these spectrums, from conservative, risky, neutral. And what we're trying to do is figure out who to assign which strategies and how those strategies work together on a community level. Now, from our data at the site, we can actually start to see some of these strategies play out. So this top is precipitation anomaly data from the TRIM, and it's showing that as this period in 2015 progresses, as our El Nino gets stronger, the red's indicating a negative precipitation anomaly, so it's actually drier than normal. The bottom data here is stem water potential, which is essentially a measure of stress within the trees. And we have 3 different tree species showing 3 distinct patterns of behavior. So these are trees of relatively the same size, but they're different species and showing different behavior. That's representing those strategies. So what we're trying to do on Blue Waters now is trying to actually take all of these trees that we've mapped in their species and assign them those strategies and try to mimic this behavior to see which strategies will prevail during these dry seasons. So I'm going to look at just a small subset here to show you an example of what we're doing. A lot of this work is really still ongoing, but it's making good progress. So if we just take a look at some subset of these trees, what we have to do is we have them modeled in space here, but we have to grow root systems for each and every one. So as you can see here, you'll have root systems of different sizes. They may overlap in different ways, have different shapes, and we use that to characterize separate different hydraulic strategies. And each of these trees has its own parameterization in terms of the conductivity of its tissues, how tolerant it is to stress, when will it stop uptaking water and start to conserve. So just seeing some of our initial data, on the left here we have data showing water uptake for these trees. The black line is the total for the domain. And what you can now see is we can actually start to separate out the contributions of each individual tree to the entire evapotranspiration, which is something that we could never do at this scale before without systems like Blue Waters. Also, beyond that, we can start to identify different levels of water stress. We can start seeing which individuals are going to experience more stress during these simulated events. Now, like I mentioned, this is still ongoing work, so right now my task is we're trying to do those ensemble simulations like I mentioned. We're going to be examining a lot of different water usage strategies, and some of those strategies are structural, just like the shape of the root systems. How deep do they go? How far do they go out? Also, hydraulic properties of the conductivity of the tissues, and like I said, how tolerant are they to water stress? And once we are able to do that, we hope to separate out the contributions of those properties to both individual drought resilience and also how it's going to affect the whole forest bulk evapotranspiration. And one important aspect of work like this is field work like this is very expensive. To go down to the Amazon and to measure trees, it's a very costly thing to do, and the infrastructure is not all that great. So if you can have any kind of model-informed campaigns where these models can tell us, okay, which parameters are most important? What are we most uncertain about to help reduce our model uncertainty? That is such valuable information, and it can help target our measurement campaigns as well. Okay, well, I have a little bit of time, but I'm just gonna, I wanna go ahead and acknowledge the Blue Waters Graduate Fellowship. I really appreciate the computational time, and also like the help I've received from the staff has been instrumental in getting my code working on Blue Waters and also helping me to advance this research. I need to acknowledge also a lot of piecemeal field grants that have helped me go down and actually measure parameters for this model and to help improve our characterization of the trees and to allow us to validate this type of work. And I wouldn't be able to do this without, like I said, the labs of Scott Seleska and Rafael Oliveira. Rafael's group is down in Brazil, and it's really important also to have these international collaborators. So with that, if you have any need to use your Blue Water swag for something else, you can always use it for science. Take it down and go measure some trees with me in the Amazon. But thank you very much.